The letter arrived on a Tuesday, but the threat came on a Wednesday. Harlan Croft didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode his horse straight through the gate of the Mercer Ranch, past the fence Gideon had repaired 3 times that summer, and he stopped just close enough to make a man feel small without technically stepping onto the porch. He had 2 riders behind him, and all 3 of them wore the same expression, the kind that said they'd already decided how this ended. Mercer. Harlan pulled off one glove, finger by finger, slow. Water rights on the North Creek. My company will take them legal or otherwise. Your choice on the timeline. Gideon said nothing. His 5-year-old daughter, Lila, was standing right behind the screen door. Harlan smiled at that. Actually smiled. Nice little girl you got. Be a shame for her to grow up watching her daddy lose everything. He put his glove back on and rode away. If you've ever watched someone threaten a child and smiled doing it, you know exactly what kind of man we're talking about. And if you've ever been the one standing on that porch, no money, no lawyer, no wife, and a little girl pressed against your leg, then you understand why Gideon Mercer sent for a stranger. Stay with us to the very end of this story. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because what Elena Rowan does when she steps off that train will change everything. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The morning Gideon sent the letter to the matrimonial agency in Denver, he burned 3 drafts in the kitchen stove before he wrote one he could live with. He didn't burn them because he was ashamed. He burned them because every version he wrote sounded like a man making excuses, and he didn't want to start whatever this was with excuses. The first draft said he was a widower in good standing with modest acreage. The second one said he was steady and reliable, looking for a companion of similar temperament. By the third draft, he'd written half a page about his late wife, Margaret, and then he'd folded it once and pushed it straight into the fire without reading it back. The fourth letter was 11 lines long. He owned 340 acres in Converse County, Wyoming. He had a daughter, age 5. He was 38 years old, in reasonable health, and not a drinking man. He needed someone capable, not someone decorative. He was not looking for romance. He was looking for a partner. He signed it, sealed it, and rode to town before he could change his mind again. That was 6 weeks before Harlan Croft came through his gate. Lila had been asking about a mother since she was 3. Not constantly, not in a way that broke your heart every single day, but in the way children ask about things they don't fully understand yet, with an almost clinical curiosity, the way she might ask why the sky turned pink at dusk, or why the horses snorted when it was cold. Where did my mama go? And then, when Gideon explained as gently as he could, the follow-up question that gutted him every time, is she coming back? He told her no. He told her Margaret wasn't coming back, and Lila had nodded, serious, the way she always was, and then gone back to whatever she'd been doing. But a few weeks later, she'd asked again. Not, where did my mama go this time? Just, can we get a new one? Gideon had stared at his daughter for a long moment. She was sitting on the kitchen floor, sorting dried beans by color into 2 piles, very focused. She didn't look up when she asked it, like it was just a practical question. He didn't answer her that day, but he thought about it for 3 months. The reply from the agency came on a Monday, a thin envelope with a Denver postmark and handwriting that was precise without being fussy. The woman's name was Elena Rowan. She was 34, originally from Ohio, most recently from a small town in Kansas where she'd worked as a seamstress and sometimes as an assistant to a county surveyor. She had no children of her own. She could cook, mend, manage accounts if needed, and had experience with livestock, though she clarified this last point in a way that made Gideon pause. I can work with animals. I am not afraid of them. I am, however, not sentimental about them, and I think you should know that before we proceed. Gideon read that line twice. He wrote back the same day. There were 3 more letters after that. They weren't romantic, they were oddly practical, almost businesslike, but not cold. Elena asked specific questions. How many head of cattle? What was the condition of the well? Did Lila have any health concerns he should know about? She asked about the nearest schoolhouse and how many miles it was from the ranch house. She did not ask what Gideon looked like. She did not mention love once. He found he respected her more for it. By the 5th letter, they had agreed on terms. She would arrive on the 23rd. She would be on the afternoon train from Cheyenne, Gideon said he would be at the station. Elena said she would be wearing a blue coat, which she then clarified was actually more of a dark teal, not quite blue. So he should look for a woman in a dark teal coat if he wanted to find her quickly. He read that bit to Lila, and Lila asked what teal was, and when Gideon tried to describe it, she said it sounded like the color of the river in summer. Maybe, Gideon said. I like that color, Lila said. Gideon folded the letter and put it in the box where he kept anything he didn't want to lose. The 23rd came and the train did not. Gideon stood on the platform at Caulfield Station for 2.5 hours with Lila holding his hand, watching the track bend away into nothing. A station agent eventually came out and told him there'd been a delay at Laramie, something about a washed section of track, and the afternoon train wouldn't arrive until closer to evening, possibly later. How much later? The agent shrugged in a way that suggested he genuinely didn't know and also didn't feel the weight of the question the way Gideon did. They ate supper at the only restaurant in Caulfield that would seat a man with a child and no reservation, a small place off the main street that smelled like wood smoke and boiled onions. Lila ate half a biscuit and then fell asleep against Gideon's shoulder before the food came. He ate one-handed, watching the window. He wasn't nervous exactly. He didn't know what he was. Margaret had been a woman he'd known for 2 years before he married her, a woman he'd grown up alongside in the same county, whose mother had taught him arithmetic in a one-room schoolhouse when he was 8. This was different. This was a woman he'd written 5 letters to and still couldn't fully picture. He kept trying to imagine her face and coming up blank. The train whistle reached them at 7:40 in the evening. He carried Lila, half asleep, to the platform. The train came in slow, a long exhale of steam and settling metal, and people began coming off in clusters. A family with too much luggage, a man in a city suit who looked like he'd taken the wrong train entirely, 2 women traveling together who laughed about something as they stepped down. And then the woman in the dark teal coat. She stepped off the train without hesitating, without that brief pause most people have at the top of the steps, that moment of adjustment to the new place. She just stepped down and looked around with a calm, assessing quality, the way someone looks when they're trying to orient quickly, not anxiously. She was carrying a single leather bag and a smaller satchel over one shoulder. No hat trunk, no wardrobe case, no evidence of the kind of woman who arrived expecting a certain amount of fanfare. She saw him before he moved. He watched her eyes do the math, man, child, searching expression, and she walked over directly. Mr. Mercer. It wasn't a question. Miss Rowan. She looked at Lila first. Lila, still drowsy, turned her head from Gideon's shoulder and blinked at this stranger in the teal coat. There was a long moment, the kind where anything could happen. And then Lila, without any particular announcement, reached out one small hand and touched the lapel of Elena's coat. It is the river color, Lila said. Elena looked at the child's hand on her coat. Then she looked at Gideon. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Not a polished smile, not the smile you put on for a new employer or a nervous introduction, but a small, surprised smile, like something had caught her off guard. I suppose it is, she said. The ride back to the ranch was mostly quiet. Gideon had brought the wagon rather than 2 horses, thinking it would be easier, and Elena sat on the bench beside him with her bag between her feet. Lila was bundled in a blanket in the wagon bed behind them, asleep inside 3 minutes of leaving the station. Elena looked at the land as they moved through it. The last of the evening light was stretching across the grass, everything going gold, and then a kind of bruised purple at the edges. She didn't comment on it the way most newcomers did, that reflex of, oh, it's beautiful, or it's so much bigger than I expected. She just watched it. The delay at Laramie, Gideon said, after a while. Was it all right? The wait? It was fine, she said. I had a book. He nodded. A mile further on, she said, What is your daughter like? Gideon thought about it. Serious, curious. She doesn't say much, but she remembers everything. She told our neighbor's wife the exact date of every rain we'd had since June. He paused. She asked me 8 months ago if we could get a new mother. She said it like she was asking about a new roof. Elena absorbed this. What did you say? I didn't say anything, not that day. He looked straight ahead at the road. I thought about it for 3 months and then I wrote to the agency. Elena nodded slowly. She seems like someone who will ask you direct questions and expect direct answers. She is exactly that, Gideon said. Good, Elena said. So will I. He glanced at her sideways just briefly. She was still looking at the land. The ranch house was not what he'd feared she would think of it, but it also wasn't what anyone would call welcoming. He'd cleaned it, he'd done his best. But 340 acres of land and 5 years of raising a child alone and managing cattle on his own terms left marks. The kitchen table had a wobble he'd never fixed. The curtains in the front room were the same ones Margaret had hung, and he hadn't touched them because he didn't know what he'd replaced them with. A set of shelves in the hallway leaned 3 degrees to the left and had leaned that way for so long that he no longer noticed. Elena noticed. But she didn't say anything about any of it that first night. She put her bag in the room Gideon had cleared out, the one that had been used as a storage room, and which he'd felt obscurely guilty about offering her, and also felt guilty about that guilt, because what was he supposed to do? Give her his room when he didn't know her? And she came back out and put her satchel on the kitchen table and asked if she could make tea. "I'll do it," Gideon said. "I'll do it," she said, and the firmness in her voice wasn't rude, but it was clear. "I want to know where things are." He sat down and let her find things. She moved through the kitchen with a methodical quality, opening the right cabinets on the first or second try, and he realized she was reading the logic of the space, what a person would put near the stove, what would be kept near the window. She found the tea on the second cabinet. She found cups without asking. She set a mug in front of him and sat across the table with her own. "Tell me about the water rights," she said. Gideon looked up. "What?" "The North Creek water rights." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Your third letter mentioned them in passing, that there had been some pressure from a cattle company nearby. I want to understand the situation before I'm in the middle of it." He hadn't expected her to remember that. He'd mentioned the water rights in maybe 2 sentences, a parenthetical almost. The way you mentioned something that's worrying you but that you don't want to seem like you're making a big deal of. "How much do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," she said, "from the beginning." So he told her. The Croft Cattle Company had been buying up water rights across Converse County for 3 years running, systematically, methodically, going after small ranches that couldn't afford to fight back and squeezing out the ones that tried. Harlan Croft, the man who ran the operation, had a lawyer in Cheyenne and apparently another in Denver, and he had a particular skill for finding the exact weakness in a man's legal position and pressing on it until something gave. The Mercer Ranch sat on a branch of the North Creek that Gideon's father had claimed in 1873. The claim was documented, the paperwork was in a box under Gideon's bed where he'd kept it for years, and he'd always assumed that was enough. He'd assumed it because he'd never had reason to think otherwise. 3 weeks ago, a man from the Croft Company had come by with a surveyor's map in a polite manner and explained that there appeared to be a discrepancy in the original filing, that the language used in the 1873 claim was ambiguous enough to raise questions about whether Gideon's rights extended to the specific branch of the creek that his cattle depended on. Gideon had told him to get off his land. The man had left. Harlan Croft had come the next day. Elena listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Where's the original paperwork?" "Under my bed." "I'd like to read it tomorrow," she said. "In the morning, before anything else." Gideon looked at her. "You know something about land claims?" "I worked for a county surveyor for 2 years," she said. "I'm not a lawyer, but I can read a legal description, and I know what ambiguous language looks like versus what's just meant to sound ambiguous to someone who doesn't know better." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She finished her tea and took both cups to the basin without being asked. "One more thing," she said with her back to him. "The man, Croft, when he came here, was your daughter home?" A pause. "She was inside," Gideon said. "She heard." Elena stood at the basin for a moment, then she turned around. "She won't hear it again," she said. Not a promise, exactly. More like a statement of intent, with nothing behind it that was soft or performative. Just the fact of it. Gideon didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to something like that. He said goodnight and went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the house settling, and thought about the fact that somewhere down the hall, there was a woman he'd written 5 letters to who had just, within 3 hours of arriving, asked to read his original land claim documents and told him his daughter wouldn't hear another threat. He didn't know what he'd expected. He didn't think he'd expected this. He He fell asleep before he could decide what this was. Lila woke up early, the way she always did, and came padding out in bare feet before the sun was fully up, and stopped cold in the kitchen doorway. Elena was already at the table. She had the box of paperwork open in front of her, and she had spread several documents across the surface in what looked like an organized pattern, and she was reading something with one finger tracing a line of text, her other hand around a fresh cup of tea. She looked up when she heard the small feet on the floor. Lila stared at her. "You're here," Lila said. "I'm here," Elena said. "I thought maybe I dreamed it." Elena considered this seriously. "How would you know the difference?" Lila considered it back. "I don't always," she admitted. Elena nodded like this was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question and pulled out the chair beside her. "Come sit. I'll tell you what I'm reading." Gideon, who had come to the kitchen doorway without making any sound, watched his daughter cross the room and climb into the chair next to this woman they'd known for less than 12 hours. He watched Elena shift two of the documents so Lila could see them and begin explaining in plain and patient language what the words meant. He didn't go in. He stood in the doorway for another minute or two, watching, and then he turned around and went back to get his boots. The first real trouble didn't wait long to announce itself. 3 days after Elena arrived, a rider came down the road toward the ranch. Not Harlan Croft himself this time, one of his men, a lean man in a brown coat named Silas Rourke, who had what you could only call a professionally unpleasant face, the face of someone hired specifically to deliver messages that the sender didn't want to deliver in person. Gideon was in the yard when Rourke rode up. Elena was near the fence, where she'd been helping him check the posts along the south end, a task she'd offered for without being asked, and approached with the same methodical quality she brought to everything. Rourke looked at Gideon. He glanced at Elena with the particular dismissive scan that men of his type gave to women they'd already decided didn't matter. "Mr. Croft extends his regards," Rourke said, "and wanted to offer you one more opportunity to discuss the water rights matter before it moves to the next stage." "Next stage," Gideon said. "Legal proceedings, Mr. Mercer. The company has filed a challenge with the county land office. You'll receive formal notice within the week." Rourke said it pleasantly, like he was delivering news about the weather. "Mr. Croft believes it would be in everyone's interest to settle this quietly, and he's prepared to offer fair compensation for a quiet transfer of rights." "The rights aren't for sale," Gideon said. "That's a position you might want to reconsider," Rourke said, and the pleasantness in his voice developed a slight edge, like something being slowly sharpened. "The legal process is expensive, slow, uncertain. For a man running a ranch alone—" "He's not alone," Elena said. Rourke looked at her. Not the dismissive glance this time, a longer look, the kind someone gives when they're recalibrating. "Ma'am," he said. "We've read the original filing," Elena said. She was still standing by the fence post, a work glove on one hand. She didn't move toward him, and she didn't raise her voice. "The 1873 claim language is specific about the North Branch. The ambiguity your company's surveyor identified is in a secondary description that references the main channel, not the branch. If your lawyers are telling Mr. Croft he has a strong case, I'd recommend he consult different lawyers." Silence. Rourke looked at Gideon. Gideon said nothing. He'd read the documents with Elena the previous evening for 2 hours. Elena talking him through every section with the same patient precision she'd used with Lila at the table, and by the end of it he understood exactly what she was saying. She was right. He'd been too close to the thing to see it, too afraid of the legal language to read it clearly, but she'd laid it out plain. Rourke looked back at Elena. There was something working behind his eyes that wasn't pleasantness anymore. "I'll pass along your thoughts," he said. "Please do," Elena said. He rode away. The dust from his horse settled slowly. Gideon waited until Rourke was far enough down the road, and then he exhaled, a long, slow breath, like something that had been wound tight in his chest had been given a fraction of release. "He'll go back and tell Croft," Gideon said. "Yes," Elena said. She pulled the glove off her hand and folded it. "And Croft will either back down or come harder." "He'll come harder." "Probably." She turned and looked at Gideon directly. "Then we need to get ahead of him. We need to file a formal affirmation of the water rights with the county before that challenge notice arrives. Is there a lawyer in Cheyenne you trust?" "There's one I've used before, Addison. He's decent." "Can you get to Cheyenne by end of the week?" "I can." "Then go," she said. "I'll stay with Lila." Bring all the original documents. She paused. Don't let Addison tell you it'll be fine without filing something. Make him file something. A man who tells you it'll be fine without writing anything down is a man who's comfortable with your risk, not his. Gideon looked at her. I've heard that before, he said. About lawyers. It's true every time, she said. She put the glove back on and went back to the fence post. That evening, Lila asked Elena to braid her hair. It wasn't the first request she'd made of Elena. Over the previous 3 days, she'd asked her to read a page of her reader, to explain what surveyors did, and to confirm whether the black and white cat that lived in the barn was a boy or a girl. Elena had handled all of these with the same matter-of-fact quality that Lila, it turned out, responded to enormously, because Lila was a child who did not particularly like to be managed or condescended to, and she had a finely tuned sense for when adults were doing either. But the braid request was different. Gideon, coming in from the barn, heard the request from the other room and stood still in the doorway. I don't know many braids, Elena said. I know one. Is that all right? What kind? Lila asked. Simple one, down the back. When I was your age, my mother did it when I was fussy and couldn't sleep. I'm not fussy, Lila said with great dignity. I know, Elena said. But it's the only one I know. A pause. Okay, Lila said. Gideon didn't go in. He heard the small sounds of it. The comb, Lila's occasional instructions about which spots hurt, Elena's voice low and even. After a few minutes, the sounds settled into quiet. And then Lila said, Are you going to stay? That's the plan, Elena said. Forever? A beat. That's what I intend, Elena said. Lila seemed to process this. My papa needed someone. He didn't say so, but I could tell. He told me in a letter, Elena said. What did he say? He said he needed a partner, someone capable. A pause. I thought that was a very honest thing to say. Most people aren't that honest. Lila was quiet for a moment. He works too much, she said, and he forgets to eat when he's fixing things. I've noticed that. You can remind him. I will, Elena said. Gideon stood in the doorway for another few seconds. Then he turned around and went outside and stood in the dark for a while, looking at nothing in particular, breathing slowly. He'd sent that letter on a Tuesday morning without knowing what would come back. He'd burned 3 drafts before he wrote one he could live with. He'd driven to the station and waited 2.5 hours on a platform and then ridden home in the dark, next to a woman he couldn't picture. And now here was that woman, in his kitchen, braiding his daughter's hair and telling Lila she intended to stay forever. And his daughter was telling her about his bad habit of forgetting to eat. And somewhere down the road, a man named Harlan Croft was planning the next thing, the harder thing, the thing that came after the polite messenger got turned away by a mail-order bride who'd read the 1873 land claim documents and found the flaw in his argument before his own lawyers had. Gideon Mercer stood in the dark outside his own house and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something earlier than that. The thing that comes before happiness when you've been a long time without it, and your body isn't sure yet whether to believe it. He went back inside. Gideon left for Cheyenne on a Thursday, before the sun was fully up. He didn't make a production of it. He packed the documents into a leather satchel. The originals, the survey map, 2 letters from previous correspondence with Addison's office. And he came into the kitchen where Elena was already at the stove, and Lila was eating oatmeal with the focused silence of someone who had opinions about breakfast but had decided not to voice them this morning. I'll be back by Saturday, he said. Possibly Friday evening, if Addison can see me today. Take the originals and leave nothing here that matters, Elena said, without turning from the stove. If Croft's men come while you're gone, I don't want anything in this house they could use. Gideon paused. You think they'd come to the house? I think Harlan Croft sent a messenger, and the messenger came back with bad news, Elena said. I think a man like that responds to bad news by escalating. She turned then, holding the pan handle with a cloth. I'm not saying they'll break down the door. I'm saying don't leave the original 1873 filing on the kitchen table. He took everything. Lila walked him to the wagon without being asked, which she didn't always do. Sometimes she said goodbye from the doorway. Sometimes she didn't say goodbye at all. And he'd find a small drawing tucked into his coat pocket later, which was her version of the same thing. This morning she walked to the wagon and stood beside it with her hands clasped behind her back, watching him check the harness with an expression that was hard to read. "You'll be careful," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'll be careful," he said. "Elena says lawyers are expensive and slow," Lila said. "She says to make him write something down." "She told me the same thing." "Good," Lila nodded, satisfied. "She told me what to do if anyone comes while you're gone." Gideon stopped checking the harness. He looked at his daughter. "She did. She said if a man comes on horseback and she doesn't know him, I go to the Tanner place and I stay there until she comes for me. She said no arguing, no asking questions. Just go." Lila paused. "I said I wasn't a baby, and she said she knew that, and it still stood." He looked back toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Elena moving, already doing something purposeful, and he had the strange sensation of a man who has handed a weight to someone else and is only now realizing how long he'd been carrying it. "You listen to her," he said. "I was going to anyway," Lila said, and walked back inside. He drove away into the gray-pink morning and did not look back more than twice. The Tanner Ranch was a mile and a half east, and Gideon had known Walt Tanner since they were both young men making bad decisions about horses. Walt's wife, Cora, had brought food to Gideon's door 4 times in the weeks after Margaret died without ever asking if he needed it, because she already knew, and she wasn't the type to ask questions she already knew the answer to. They were good neighbors in the truest sense, present when needed, absent when not. Elena had introduced herself to Cora Tanner on the second day, walking over with Lila in tow and no particular announcement. She'd brought a jar of preserved peaches she'd found in the cellar and apparently decided were better deployed as an introduction than left to sit on a shelf. Gideon had heard about this secondhand from Cora later, who had said, with a quality in her voice he couldn't quite name, "That woman of yours walked in here like she'd known us for years. Didn't gush, didn't over-explain, just sat down and asked Walt how his fence line was holding up." A pause. "I like her." Gideon had said that was good. "No," Cora had said. "I mean, I actually like her. That's not nothing." He thought about that on the road to Cheyenne, about what it meant that Cora Tanner, who had a well-calibrated instinct for people and had disliked the previous county assessor on site and been proven right inside a year, had looked at Elena Rowan and said that was not nothing. He thought about the way Elena had sat across from him at the kitchen table 4 nights ago and said, "I'd like to read the original documents in the morning, before anything else." The first night she'd arrived, barely unpacked, and she was already asking to read the legal papers. Not because it was her job, not because anyone had asked her to, because she'd understood from a few sentences in a letter that there was something threatening and she'd decided she wanted to understand it before it got closer. He wasn't sure what he'd expected from a mail-order arrangement. Something functional, maybe. Someone who would manage the house and keep Lila from running wild and make the place feel less like an aftermath. He hadn't expected someone who read land claim filings and corrected a company messenger's legal argument while standing at a fence post with a work glove on. He made good time to Cheyenne. The weather held. Back at the ranch, Elena spent the first hour after Gideon left doing exactly what she did every morning, methodically, without wasted motion. She fed the chickens and checked the water level in the trough, and went over the east fence line Gideon had been meaning to address for 2 weeks. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just didn't know how to be in a place without working to understand it, and understanding a place meant learning what it needed. Lila followed her for most of this, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just watching with that serious expression she had, the one that made her look like a small person who was taking notes she'd review later. "The fence post here is rotted at the base," Elena said, crouching down to look at it. "See this? The wood goes soft and dark. That's water damage from below. Can you fix it?" "I can set a new post alongside it and bind them together. It won't be perfect, but it'll hold." She stood. "Your father knows this one's weak. He's been prioritizing the north end." "He's always prioritizing something," Lila said. "He has a list. He shows me sometimes." "Does the list have an order?" "He says it does. He changes it." Elena made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement and kept walking the line. Lila kept pace beside her, her boots leaving uneven prints in the soft earth. "Elena," Lila said. Were you married before?" Elena kept her eyes on the fence line. "No." "Why not?" "Different reasons at different times," Elena said. "When I was younger, The man I thought I'd marry changed his mind. After that, I was busy with work, and then busy with other things, and the years have a way of adding up before you've made a decision about them. Lila considered this. Were you sad about the man who changed his mind? For a while, Elena said. And then I was angry. And then I was mostly just tired of thinking about it. And now? Now I'm here, Elena said, and she said it without weight, without the particular tone that invites a follow-up question. Just a fact. She pointed at the next post. This one's good. See the color difference? Solid all the way down. Lila looked at the post, then she looked at Elena. I'm glad you're here, she said. Elena looked at her. I know, she said. I could tell from the train platform. Lila smiled, a brief bright thing, and moved ahead to the next post to check it herself. The trouble came not from horseback, as Elena had half expected, but from the ground level. She was in the yard that afternoon when she noticed the water in the trough had dropped more than it should have, enough that it caught her attention. She checked the tank at the back of the house, lower than yesterday. Then she walked to the north corner of the property where the creek branch came closest to the fence line. The creek was running low, not dry, not by a distance, but noticeably reduced, less than it should have been for the time of year, and she stood at the bank and looked upstream at the line of willows and cottonwoods bending north, and something in her settled into a very cold, precise kind of attention. She told Lila to go inside and stay there. She didn't explain. Is something wrong? Lila asked. Go inside, Elena said. Take a book. She walked the creek north as far as the property line, and then stood at the fence and looked across Croft's land. She couldn't see much. The land rolled away and there were trees, and she couldn't see what was happening further north where the creek's headwater fed into this branch. But she could read what the water was telling her. Someone had interfered with the flow upstream. She wasn't certain. She was careful about what she claimed to be certain about. But in the 2 years she'd worked with the county surveyor in Kansas, she'd seen this before. The deliberate manipulation of water flow as a pressure tactic, a way to demonstrate to a small rancher what life looked like when the water didn't come, before you'd even won the legal argument. It was subtle and it was hard to prove, and it was exactly the kind of move a man like Harlan Croft would know about. She went back to the house and wrote 2 things. The first was a letter to Gideon at Addison's office in Cheyenne, telling him what she'd found and telling him to make sure the formal filing addressed not just the rights themselves, but any interference with the water flow, that this was potentially a separate legal issue and Addison needed to know. The second was a short note to Walt Tanner asking if she could come by that evening for a conversation. She sent both with the boy who came by to collect the outgoing mail at 3 o'clock. Cora Tanner sent word back within the hour. Come for supper, Sam. Walt Tanner had the hands of a man who had worked every day of his adult life and the face of someone who'd spent most of those days outdoors in all kinds of weather. He was not a man who said a lot, but what he said tended to count. He listened to Elena's account of the water level over 2 cups of coffee and a meal he barely touched because he was concentrating. When she finished, he said, They did this to Clement Walsh 3 years ago. Elena looked at him. Walsh, the ranch south of here? Was. Walsh sold. Before he sold, he told me they'd dropped his creek level twice inside a month, right in the middle of summer, and by the time he could prove anything or find anyone to listen, his cattle were in trouble and he couldn't afford to wait for the legal process. Walt set his cup down. He took their price. He said it was less than fair and he'd never forgive himself for it, but he had no choice by then. Elena was quiet for a moment. Who was Croft's lawyer on that, she said. Man named Dreyer, based in Denver. She filed that away. Is Walsh still in the county? Moved his family to Laramie. His wife's family is there. Walt paused. He'd talk to you, I think. He's not a man who got over what happened. I may need him to make a statement, Elena said. Not for the water issue directly, for a pattern of behavior. If we can show Croft did this to Walsh before us, it changes the nature of the filing. It's not an isolated dispute anymore. Walt and Cora exchanged a look. Not the kind that meant they had doubts. The kind between 2 people who've been together long enough that a look carries a full conversation. You've done this kind of thing before, Cora said. Not in a court, Elena said, but I've watched someone else do it, and I paid attention. Walt nodded slowly. I'll write to Walsh tonight. I'd be grateful, Elena said. She rode home in the dark and found Lila asleep on the kitchen bench with her head on her folded arms and a reader open in front of her, which was her particular way of falling asleep, pretending until it wasn't pretending anymore. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this child who had said, "I'm glad you're here," in a voice that had no performance in it, just plain fact. She picked Lila up and carried her to bed. The child stirred but didn't wake. Elena sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. She was not frightened, exactly. She'd been frightened before. Real fear, the kind that came from a specific place and a specific memory she kept at a certain distance. And this wasn't quite that. This was something more like a long, clear-eyed recognition of the size of the problem and a mental inventory of what she had to work with. What she had was this: the original documents, which were solid, a surveyor's training that wasn't formal but wasn't nothing, Walt Tanner and Cora, who were steady and smart and angry on their neighbor's behalf, Clement Walsh, possibly, if his anger had lasted 3 years, which Walt's face suggested it had, and Gideon, a man who'd been fighting this alone and who had, without knowing it, been about to let the fear of legal language cost him what the legal language actually said he owned. What she didn't have was time. Croft would know the messenger had come back empty. He would know that someone on the Mercer property had read the original filing and understood it. He would recalibrate. And a man who recalibrated fast was a man who'd already been thinking about the second move before the first one was even answered. She went to bed and slept 4 hours, which was enough. Gideon came back Friday evening, not Saturday. He came through the door looking like a man who had spent 2 days sitting in an office having a legal discussion, which was exactly what he'd done. Tired in a specific way, dusty from the road, carrying the satchel and an expression she couldn't quite read from across the room. "Addison filed," he said, "a formal affirmation of rights with a request for judicial notice. He said it was solid." "Did he say anything else?" "He said we were in good shape." Gideon set the satchel down. "And then I told him to write that down, and he looked at me like I'd said something strange, and I told him my wife had advised me not to leave his office without something on paper." Elena looked at him. He said "my wife" without particular emphasis, just as the accurate word for what she was. And something in the room adjusted slightly, like a door that had been open a crack had swung a few degrees further. "Good," she said. "I need to tell you what I found at the creek." She told him. She watched his face as she laid it out. The water level, the comparison to what Walsh had experienced, Walt's account, the letter she'd written to him in Cheyenne. He didn't interrupt. By the time she finished, his jaw had a set to it that she recognized from the day Rourke had ridden up. "They're trying to run us dry," he said. "Before the legal process can even get started," she said. "If the cattle are in distress by midsummer, the pressure to sell becomes something else. It's not just a legal argument anymore. It's survival." Walsh couldn't hold on. "Walsh didn't know what was happening until it was too late," Elena said. "We know now. That's different." Gideon pulled a chair and sat down heavily. He rubbed his face with both hands, the way he did when he was thinking hard about something uncomfortable. "What do we do?" "First, document what's happening at the creek. Record the water level every morning. Measurements, not impressions. Written and dated." She sat across from him. "Second, Walt's writing to Walsh tonight. If Walsh will make a statement about what happened to him, we can add it to the filing as evidence of a pattern. Addison needs to know about this." "I'll ride back to Cheyenne." "Write him," Elena said. "Faster and cheaper, and the letter is a record. Writing back costs you 2 days and the creek doesn't stop while you're gone." He looked at her. There was something in his face, not quite frustration, not quite relief, more like the expression of a man who'd been making decisions alone for a long time and was having to get used to the feeling of someone thinking alongside him at the same pace. "You mapped this out," he said. "While I was gone, you mapped the whole thing out." "I had time," she said. "Elena." He stopped, started again. "I want to say something, and I'm not sure I know how to say it right." "Try anyway," she said. He looked at the table. "I wrote that letter to the agency because Lila needed someone. That was the whole reason. I wasn't thinking past that. Wasn't thinking about what it meant to have a person in the house, a full person with their own—" He stopped. "I didn't think past Lila. I want you to know I understand that wasn't fair to you, to bring you here with 5 letters and a practical arrangement and then hand you a land dispute and a creek problem and a man named Croft." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Gideon," she said, "I read your letters before I agreed to come, all 5 of them. You didn't hide the water rights issue. You mentioned it. I made a choice. She met his eyes. I'm not here because you handed me something difficult. I'm here because I chose to come to a place where there was real work to do. He held her gaze for a beat. That's a generous way to put it. It's the accurate way, she said. Lila appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose, squinting at her father like she wasn't entirely convinced he was real. You came back, she said. I said I would, Gideon said. You said Friday evening, maybe, Lila said, with the precision of someone who'd been tracking the exact language of the prediction. It's Friday evening. It is. She walked over and climbed into his lap with the unself-conscious confidence of a 5-year-old who has no doubts about her welcome, and he wrapped one arm around her and she leaned back against him and looked at Elena. Did you tell him about the creek? Lila asked Elena. Elena blinked. You knew about the creek? I saw you looking at it, Lila said. You had your thinking face, and you told me to go inside. I told you to go inside because I didn't want you out by the fence, Elena said. I know, Lila said. I went inside. I just looked out the window after. Gideon made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Elena pressed her lips together. I'll remember that about the window, she said. So did you tell him? Lila pressed. Yes, Elena said. We have a plan. Lila seemed to find this acceptable. She settled more comfortably against her father and said nothing further, the way she sometimes did after she'd confirmed the things she wanted to confirm. Just settled into the quiet of it, like a verdict had been delivered, and she was satisfied. The letter from Walsh arrived 8 days later. Walt brought it over himself rather than sending it, which told Elena something about how he read its contents before he even opened his mouth. He came in the late morning when Gideon was in the yard and Elena was in the kitchen, and he sat down at the table and put the envelope down and said, He'll make the statement. He's angrier than I even thought. She read the letter. Clement Walsh wrote the way a man wrote when he'd been holding something for a long time, and someone had finally asked, without flourish, without hesitation, in plain, clear sentences that described exactly what had happened to his water flow in the summer of 1879, how long it took him to understand what was being done, how Croft's lawyer Dreyer had shown up 6 days into the problem with an offer that was timed, Walsh now understood, to land when he was most desperate. He had sold. He had taken the price. He wanted anyone who read this letter to know that Harlan Croft and the man named Dreyer had done this deliberately and with specific knowledge of the pressure they were applying. The letter was 4 pages long and read like testimony. Elena set it down on the table. Walt said, Is it enough? With what we already have? Yes, she said. This changes the shape of the whole thing. It's not a property dispute anymore. It's a scheme. She looked at Walt. Did he say whether he'd repeat this in front of a judge? He said he'd ride to Cheyenne himself if someone asked him to. She nodded. Then she picked up the letter and folded it carefully back into the envelope. I'm going to write to Addison today. I want him to understand what we have before Croft's lawyers make their next move, because they will. Walt stood. You know, Gideon's father tried to fight a boundary dispute with a neighbor about 15 years ago. He lost. Not because he was wrong, but because he didn't know how to fight it. He didn't know what to do with the papers, who to talk to, what questions to ask. He looked at Elena steadily. Gideon's been carrying that. He thinks losing is what you do when someone like Croft comes at you. Elena absorbed this. He won't lose this one, she said. No, Walt said. I don't think he will. He picked up his hat. Not with you reading the papers. After he left, Elena sat at the table for a moment with the letter in front of her. Then she got up and went to find Gideon. He was at the fence, the east section, the one she'd flagged the first week. He'd gotten the new post and was sinking it alongside the rotted one, doing it by feel and experience, and she stood a few feet away and waited until he looked up. Walsh wrote, she said. He'll make a statement. Croft did this to him deliberately, and there's a lawyer named Dreyer who coordinated the timing. Gideon set down the post driver. Dirt on his hands, sweat on his shirt, looking at her with the full weight of what she'd just said settling onto his face. Dreyer, he said. That name was on one of the notices Croft filed, in small print. I didn't look twice at it. He's working both sides of the county and probably more beyond that. She held up the envelope. This letter is evidence of a pattern that goes back at least 3 years. Addison can use it, but Gideon, We need to move fast. Croft doesn't know we have this, and I want it in Addison's hands before Croft's next step lands. Gideon looked at her. The afternoon light was flat and direct, and it put everything plainly. The lines of his face, the work he'd been doing, the look in his eyes that wasn't quite what she'd seen on the first night, or the night she'd told him to file something, or even the night he'd come back from Cheyenne and said, "My wife," like it was simply the word. It was something else. Something that had been moving toward a shape for a week and a half and was now almost visible. "I don't know what I would have done," he said, "if you hadn't read those papers." "You would have figured it out eventually," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but not before Croft got ahead of me." She didn't argue the point, because he was probably right, and she wasn't in the habit of arguing points that were probably right, just to be gracious. "Write to Addison tonight," she said. "I'll draft the language if you want it." "I want it," he said. She nodded and turned back toward the house. She was 3 steps away when he said her name. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the work. I mean, for the work too, but—" He stopped. "Just, thank you." She turned her head partway back. She didn't look at him directly, just slightly past him, at the fence line and the land beyond it, gold and brown and wide. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. And then she went in to write the letter. The creek level dropped again 2 days later. Elena measured it at first light, wrote the number in the ledger she'd started keeping, and made the notation clinical and precise. Third drop in 11 days. Upstream interference continuing. Pattern consistent with Walsh account. She capped the pen. Harlan Croft was coming. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Not with fear, but with the particular alertness of someone who's been watching the signs and has finished being surprised by them. She went inside and put the kettle on and waited for Gideon to come in from the morning check. There was work to do, and she was ready for it. The letter from Addison arrived on a Monday, and it was not the letter Elena had been hoping for. She read it standing at the kitchen table, still in her work coat, because she'd taken it from the mail rider before she'd even come inside. Gideon was at the barn. Lila was at the Tanner place for the morning, a arrangement that had become regular enough that Lila now packed her own small bag the night before without being reminded. Addison wrote in the careful, hedged language of a lawyer who had encountered a problem he didn't want to be blamed for. The formal affirmation filing had been received by the county land office. However, and here the letter's tone shifted in a way Elena had learned to distrust, the county land officer had indicated that the challenge filed by the Croft Cattle Company's legal representatives had raised a procedural question about the original 1873 claim. Specifically, a question about whether the filing had been properly witnessed under the territorial rules in effect at that time. The land officer had placed both filings in a suspended status pending review. Addison believed this was a delay tactic, and almost certainly was, but he wanted Gideon to be aware that the matter could not move forward until the procedural question was resolved, which could take, his estimate, 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. Elena set the letter down. She stood at the table and looked at the window and did the arithmetic she'd been afraid to do since the third water measurement. The creek level had dropped 4 times in 11 days. If it continued at that rate, and there was no reason to think Croft would stop pressing once he'd started, the cattle would begin to show stress within 3 weeks, maybe less if July came in hot. And if the cattle were in distress before the legal suspension resolved, Croft's people would show up with a new offer timed, as they'd timed it for Walsh, to land when the pressure was worst. 4 to 6 weeks was too long. She picked the letter back up and read it again, slowly, looking for anything Addison had said that wasn't just hedge and estimate. There was one line near the end, almost parenthetical, that she read 3 times. The procedural question hinges on the witness signature on the original filing. If the witnessing party can be identified and their testimony obtained, the question would likely be resolved in your favor immediately. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went to the barn. Gideon was repairing a bridle, standing in the light that came through the open barn door, and he looked up when she came in. He read her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She gave him the whole letter first and let him read it and watched his expression move through several things: confusion, then the particular tightening around the eyes that she now recognized as his version of controlled anger. "Procedural question," he said when he lowered the letter. "It's a delay tactic," she said. "Addison knows it. The county land officer either doesn't know it or is choosing not to know it. Which is it? I don't know yet. She looked at him. But the witness question, the original 1873 filing, do you know anything about who witnessed it? Your father's signature is on it, but there's a second signature I couldn't read clearly. The ink was faded. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bridle in his hands. My father's friend, he said slowly. Hector Birch. They came out here together in the early 70s, two men from the same county in Illinois. Hector filed his own claim about 8 miles north. He paused. He sold his land in, I don't know, 81 maybe, moved away. Do you know where? I know he had a sister in Nebraska. He looked up. I'd have to think, 60-something by now, if he's alive. He doesn't have to be in front of a judge, Elena said. He just has to make a written statement that he witnessed the signature, a sworn affidavit. If we can get that, Addison can file it against the procedural challenge and the suspension lifts. Gideon set the bridle down on the bench. Elena, I haven't heard from Hector Birch in 6 years. Do you have a last known address? A letter? Anything? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there's a box in the house. In the room. In Margaret's room. I haven't gone through it since she died. But she kept correspondence, kept everything. She was organized that way. He stopped. There might be something. Elena waited. He didn't move for a moment. She understood why. The room where his wife's things still were, organized and untouched for more than 4 years. She wasn't going to push him on that. I'll look, he said finally. This afternoon. She nodded. Okay. He picked the bridle back up, not because the work needed doing right now, but because he needed something to do with his hands. She understood that too. The creek level dropped again this morning, she said. I measured it. I know, he said. I checked the north trough. It's holding, but not by much. We need to move the east herd to the lower pasture where the groundwater's better, she said. It won't solve it, but it buys time. I was thinking the same thing. He looked at her. You want to do it today? This afternoon, she said, after you look at the box. He nodded and went back to the bridle, and she went back to the house. I went into Margaret's room at 2 in the afternoon. Elena did not follow him. She stayed in the kitchen and found things to do that kept her near the house but not near the hall. She heard the door open. She heard the sound of someone moving in a room that had been still for a long time. A particular quality to those sounds, careful and reluctant, not like searching but like something more deliberate. He was in there for almost an hour. When he came out, he had dust on his sleeve and a piece of paper in his hand and an expression on his face that Elena did not look at directly, because some things were not her business yet and might never be. Nebraska City, he said. There's a letter from Hector to my father from 1882. Return address is a boarding house on Miller Street in Nebraska City. Elena looked at the paper. He may not still be there. He may not be alive, Gideon said, but it's somewhere to start. She took the paper and looked at the address. I'll write today. We mark it urgent and we pay for the fastest mail. And if there's no answer, then we find another way to address the procedural question, but we start here. She set the paper on the table between them. Gideon, the letter. Addison mentioned the county land officer. Do you know him personally? His name? Russ Hargrove. He's been the land officer for 4 years. We've talked twice, maybe 3 times. He's not a man I know well. Has he ever had dealings with Croft? Gideon's eyes shifted. I don't know that for certain. But you're not certain he hasn't. A pause. No, he said. She nodded slowly. That was the answer she'd half expected. She'd been thinking about the phrasing in Addison's letter, the county land officer has indicated, and the way it suggested Hargrove had moved quickly to suspend both filings. A neutral officer might have done that. An officer with an interest in the outcome would have done it faster. Walt Tanner would know, she said. Tanner knows everyone in this county and who's connected to what. I'll ask him tonight. Ask him carefully, Elena said. Don't tell him why yet. Just ask him how well Hargrove gets along with the cattle companies. Gideon looked at her with a quality she recognized, the same look he'd had when she'd told him to make Addison write something down, like a man recalibrating the shape of a problem he'd thought he understood. You think Hargrove is on Croft's payroll, he said. I think it's a question worth asking before we assume the suspension is just a procedural delay, she said. If Hargrove can be influenced, then even when we resolve the witness question, the next obstacle will be waiting. The words sat in the air. Then what do we do? Gideon said. We find out first, she said. Then we decide. Walt Tanner's answer came that same evening, delivered in person over the Mercer kitchen table with a cup of coffee he barely touched. Hargrove and Croft aren't friends exactly, Walt said, but Croft's company donated the equipment for the new land office building 2 years ago. Hargrove made a speech at the dedication. He looked at Gideon. Make of that what you will. Gideon made the same thing of it Elena did. She could see it in the way he set his jaw. There's more, Walt said, and something in his voice made both of them look at him. I asked around today, quiet-like, after you came by last night. Hargrove filed a property transfer 3 weeks ago. Small parcel, nothing that makes noise. One of the parties listed was a holding company called Meridian Land and Water. Elena straightened. That name, she said. You know it? Walt asked. It's in the Walsh letter, she said. She was already moving toward the shelf where she kept the correspondence. She found Walsh's letter and opened it and read the 3rd page. Walsh wrote that when Dreyer showed up with the offer, the purchase agreement was in the name of Meridian Land and Water, not the Croft Cattle Company directly. He thought it was strange, but he was too desperate by then to push on it. The 3 of them looked at each other. Croft's hiding behind a holding company, Gideon said. He's been doing it for at least 3 years, Elena said. The cattle company is the face. Meridian is where the actual land and water rights go. She set the letter down. And if Hargrove is transferring parcels to Meridian, then he's not just sympathetic to Croft. He's a participant. Walt exhaled slowly. That's a serious thing to say about a county officer. I know what it is, Elena said. That's why I'm saying it carefully, in this kitchen, and not anywhere else yet. She looked at Gideon. But if it's true, it changes everything, because it means this isn't just about the water rights on your property. It's a coordinated scheme across the county, and Hargrove is helping it along. How do we prove that? Gideon said. The property transfer Walt mentioned. That's a public record, Elena said. Anyone can request a copy from the land office. Gideon, you need to go to the land office and request a copy of that transfer, not to confront anyone, just to get the document. They might not give it to me if Hargrove's involved. They have to, she said. It's public record. If they refuse, the refusal itself is something Addison can use. She looked at Walt. And we need every public record involving Meridian Land and Water that's been filed in this county in the last 5 years. Is there someone in the land office who isn't Hargrove? There's a clerk, Walt said. Young man, earnest type, name's Fitch. He's been there about a year. Does he know what Hargrove's doing? I doubt it, Walt said. He seems like the kind of person who'd be sick about it if he did. Elena filed that away. Don't approach him yet, not until we know more. Walt nodded. He picked up his coffee cup, remembered it was cold, set it down again. You know what this is turning into, he said. Not a question. Yes, Elena said. If you go at Hargrove directly, we're not going at anyone directly, she said. We're building a record, a complete one. When it's complete, we take it to someone above Hargrove's authority, the Territorial Land Commissioner in Cheyenne, if we have to. Walt was quiet for a moment. My wife's cousin works in the commissioner's office, he said. Has for 8 years. The room was very still. Walt, Gideon said. I know, Walt said. I know what I'm saying. He looked at Elena steadily. You're certain about this? Because once I write to my wife's cousin, this goes somewhere it can't come back from. Elena looked at him without flinching. The creek level has dropped 4 times in 11 days. Walsh sold his land because the same man did this to him 3 years ago, and he didn't know it until it was too late. Hargrove is in the transfer records. She paused. I'm certain enough. Walt nodded once. I'll write tonight, he said. What? 3 days passed, and the water dropped again, and the herd was restless in the lower pasture in the particular way cattle got when something in their environment was wrong, and their bodies knew it before their behavior fully showed it. Elena watched them in the mornings and wrote numbers in the ledger and did not let her face show anything that Lila could read as worry, because Lila was watching everything. The child had asked once, carefully, whether they were going to have to leave. Elena had looked at her and said no, and she'd said it the same way she said things that were true. Not loud, not performed, just level. Lila had nodded and gone back to what she was doing. On the fourth day after Walt's letter went out, something else arrived. Not from Cheyenne, not from Nebraska City, but from the direction of the Croft Ranch, which meant it came from the west on horseback, and it came in the form of 3 men, not one. Harlan Croft himself was in the middle. Elena was in the yard when they rode up. She'd been carrying a water bucket from the pump, and she set it down and stood where she was, which was between the house and the fence gate, and watched them come. Croft was in his 50s, a big man with the look of someone who had been physically imposing when he was young and had let it settle into something more horizontal without losing the core of the impression. He wore a good coat. He had the face of someone who had not been told no recently enough to remember what it felt like. The 2 men with him were not Rourke. These were different, harder looking, saying nothing, staying a step back. Not messengers. Something else. Croft stopped his horse at the gate and looked at Elena with the assessing quality of a man who has been told that a woman has been the obstacle and is now looking at that woman and trying to reconcile the information. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Croft," she said. He looked at the house. "Your husband home?" "He'll be here shortly," she said. Which was true. Gideon was in the far pasture, and she'd sent Lila running to get him the moment she'd seen the riders come over the ridge. She did not tell Croft this. "I'll wait then," Croft said, and there was something in his voice that made the word wait sound like something other than patience. She did not invite him to dismount. She stood where she was. He looked at her again with that recalibrating quality. "You've been busy," he said, "filing letters, collecting testimony from old neighbors. Very busy for a woman who's been in Wyoming for, what is it, a month?" 3 weeks and 4 days, Elena said. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has decided something and is presenting pleasantness as a courtesy before the decision takes effect. "I came to offer your husband one last chance to settle this quietly. The offer I had before still stands, and I'll add 10% in consideration of the trouble this process has caused." He paused. "After today, the offer expires." "I see," Elena said. "You understand what that means." "It means you move to the next stage," she said, "which you were going to do regardless of what we answered today." She kept her voice even, almost conversational. "Mr. Croft, you filed a procedural challenge through the county land office 3 days after your messenger came back empty-handed. You've been manipulating the creek flow on our property for nearly 2 weeks. You did the same thing to Clement Walsh in the summer of 1879. She watched his face. "I don't think you came here today to offer us anything. I think you came to see how much we know." The smile went away. Not dramatically, it just left. And what was underneath it was a face that was accustomed to being in control of situations and was not currently in control of this one and was deciding what to do about that. "You should be careful," he said, "about making accusations." "I haven't made any," she said. "I stated facts. Walsh's signed letter is in the hands of our attorney in Cheyenne. The water flow records are in our house. The Meridian land and water transfer at the county land office is a public document." She looked at him steadily. "All of that is simply true. Whether it's an accusation depends on whether it describes something wrong." The 2 men behind Croft had gone very still. Croft looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She did not move, and she did not look away, and she did not let her hands do anything they didn't do on an ordinary morning. "You're a very determined woman," Croft said. His voice was different now. The pleasantness was gone, and what was underneath was not quite threat, but in the neighborhood of it, that tone that implied a promise was being made that nobody had said out loud. "I am," Elena said. "So is my husband." Hoofbeats from behind the house. Gideon came around the corner at a pace that said Lila had run fast and told him clearly, and he slowed when he saw the configuration. Croft in the gate, Elena in the yard, the 2 silent men at the rear. He read it in a second and pulled up beside Elena and said nothing, just stood there, and she felt without looking at him the particular quality of his standing there, which was the quality of a man who has made a decision and is not going back on it. Croft looked at them both. At the 2 of them, standing together in the yard of the ranch, he'd been planning to absorb into his operation for 2 years. "Think carefully," Croft said. "We already have," Gideon said. It was the first thing he'd said. His voice was flat and certain in a way Elena had not heard before from him. Not angry, not defensive, just completely settled. Like a fence post that had been sunk properly, all the way down. Croft held it for another moment. Then he turned his horse. He rode away without another word, the two men following, and the dust of them moved down the road, and Elena watched it go and felt her pulse do something it had been doing for the last several minutes, which she had not let show, and would not let show, until they were inside. Gideon waited until the riders were gone. Then he said, "Meridian land and water." "He heard it," Elena said. "He knows we know about it." "Good." "Or not good," she said. "A man like that, when he knows someone has found the thread, he either backs down or he pulls the thread harder to see how much unravels." Gideon looked at her. "Which do you think he does?" She turned toward the house. "Get Lila," she said. "She's still at the pasture fence." "Elena." "I think he pulls the thread," she said quietly. "So we need to be ready for what comes next." What came next came faster than she'd expected, and from a direction she hadn't fully accounted for. The clerk named Fitch came to the ranch the following morning. He came alone, on foot, which meant he'd left his horse somewhere on the road and walked the last part, which was either very careful or very frightened, or both. He was younger than Elena had pictured from Walt's description, early 20s, with the look of someone who hadn't slept properly and had been carrying something he didn't know what to do with. He knocked on the door, and when Elena answered, he said, "Mrs. Mercer, I'm sorry to come without. I work at the land office. I need to speak to you and your husband. I don't have much time." She looked at him. She looked behind him at the empty road. "Come in," she said. His name was Thomas Fitch, and he had been the land office clerk for 14 months, and in those 14 months he had filed documents, maintained records, and done his job with the thoroughness of someone who found proper procedure genuinely satisfying. 3 weeks ago, he had filed the Croft Cattle Company's procedural challenge at Hargrove's direction. He had not thought much about it at the time. Then 2 days ago, Hargrove had told him to pull the Meridian land and water transfers from the public files and mark them as pending internal review, which would make them temporarily inaccessible. He said it was routine, Fitch said. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea Elena had put in front of him that he hadn't drunk. Routine internal review, but I know what those files are. I filed most of them, and I know they're not under any review process that would require them to be pulled. He stopped. Someone had requested a copy before he pulled them. I don't know who, but I think... He stopped again. You think Hargrove found out about the request and pulled the files before the copy could be made, Elena said. Fitch looked at her. Yes. Gideon, who had come in from the barn when Elena called, was leaning against the wall across the room. Who requested the copy? I don't know for certain, Fitch said. I wasn't there when the request came in. But the timing... He looked at the table. Mr. Mercer, what's in those files is... There are transfers that go back 3 years, 14 properties. Water rights on 8 of them. All transferred to Meridian, all at below-value prices, most of them within 30 days of a water disruption being recorded on the property. The kitchen was very quiet. 14 properties, Gideon said. That I could find, Fitch said. There may be more. Elena looked at Fitch steadily. Mr. Fitch, why are you here? He looked up at her. His face had the expression of someone who'd been asking himself the same question since he left the land office that morning. Because what Hargrove is doing is wrong, he said. And because I filed some of those documents and I didn't know what they were, and now I do, and I don't... He stopped. I didn't know what else to do. Did you make copies before Hargrove pulled the files? Elena said. A pause. A long pause. Fitch reached into his coat and took out a folded sheaf of papers and set them on the table. Elena looked at the papers. Then she looked at Fitch. You could lose your position for this, she said. You understand that? Yes, he said, and possibly more depending on how far Croft's reach goes. Yes, he said again. He had the look of someone who had thought about this and decided anyway, not because it was easy, but because the alternative had gotten intolerable somewhere in the last 48 hours. Gideon pushed off the wall and came to the table and looked at the papers without touching them. How complete is this? Complete enough, Fitch said. The transfer records, the dates, the property descriptions, the Meridian name on each one. And He reached into his coat again and pulled out one more document, this one a single sheet. This one I think is the most important. It's a deed of partial interest in Meridian Land and Water Company, filed last year. One of the named interest holders is Russell Hargrove. Gideon stared at the paper. He owns part of the company, Gideon said. A 15% interest, Fitch said. Elena sat down. She hadn't intended to sit down. She just needed a second to recalibrate because what Fitch had brought them was not just evidence of a pattern. It was the entire mechanism, laid out in public records, that a county officer had been systematically filing and then trying to bury, and it was the kind of thing that did not stay in a county land office once the right person in the territorial commissioner's office had seen it. She thought of Walt's letter, Walt's wife's cousin, 8 years in the commissioner's office. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "can you leave these papers with us?" "They're copies," he said. "The originals are— I don't know what Hargrove has done with the originals. He may have destroyed them, or he may have just pulled them from public access. But these copies are accurate. I made them myself." "Then yes," she said. "Leave them." He pushed the papers across the table. He stood, and he looked older than he had when he'd come through the door, the way people look after they've done something they can't undo. "What happens now?" he said. "We send everything to the territorial commissioner," Elena said. "Today, if possible." "Will it work?" She looked at him honestly. "I don't know," she said. "But Hargrove's name is on a company that has been buying water rights from ranchers after those ranchers' water was interfered with, and Hargrove has been overseeing the legal process that's supposed to protect those ranchers. That's not a small thing." She paused. "It's enough to start." Fitch nodded. He put on his hat. He looked at Gideon. "Your father's ranch, Mr. Mercer," he said. "It's been in your family a long time?" "Since 1873, Gideon said. Fitch nodded again, something working in his face that he didn't put into words. Then he left, going back out the way he came, down the road without his horse, and Elena watched him go through the kitchen window. "Walt needs to know about this today," she said. "His letter to the commissioner's office needs to go out with these documents, all of it together." "I'll ride to the Tanner place now," Gideon said. "Take copies." She was already sorting the papers, her hands steady, organizing them by date. "And Gideon, we need to talk to Addison too. He needs the full picture before Croft's lawyers make another move, because they will. Croft came here yesterday, and we told him what we knew. He'll go to his lawyers today." "How much time do we have?" She looked at the papers in her hands. 14 properties, 8 sets of water rights, Hargrove's name on the deed. "Less than we'd like," she said. "More than Walsh had." Gideon took the copies and went out to the barn, and she heard him saddle up fast, the sounds of a man with a purpose and not enough hours in the day. And she turned back to the table and kept sorting. From the other room, Lila said, "Elena." She looked up. Lila was standing in the doorway, having come in from wherever she'd been without making any sound, in the manner she had of appearing in rooms when things were happening. She looked at the papers spread across the table, and then she looked at Elena. "Are we winning?" she said. Elena looked at this child, 5 years old and serious-faced, who had asked whether they were leaving and accepted the answer no, who had listened at windows and remembered everything and asked direct questions and expected direct answers. "We're not losing," Elena said. Lila considered this. "That's not the same thing." "No," Elena said, "it's not. But right now it's what's true." Lila walked over and climbed into the chair where she always sat and looked at the papers with the expression she had when she was trying to understand something she didn't have all the vocabulary for yet. "What can I do?" she said. Elena looked at her. Then she slid the Walsh letter across the table and pointed to the return address. "Read me that address again," she said. "I want to make sure I have it right." Lila leaned forward and read it out, carefully, letter by letter. Elena wrote it down. Outside, Gideon's horse was already moving down the road toward the Tanner place, fast, carrying copies of documents that could change everything or change nothing, and the creek ran low at the north edge of the property, and somewhere in Cheyenne a lawyer named Dreyer was earning his fee, and somewhere above all of it the structure of what Harlan Croft had been building for 3 years was showing, for the first time, the places where it could come apart. Elena wrote the address. She wrote the letter. She did not let her hands shake, though they wanted to, just slightly, in the way hands did when they'd been holding something tightly for too long. She sealed the envelope and set it on the table and said to Lila, When your father gets back, remind him this goes out today." "Today," Lila repeated. "Today," Elena said. The envelope went out that afternoon with the mail rider, thick with Fitch's copied documents, Walsh's letter, the creek measurement ledger, and Elena's carefully drafted summary addressed to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Cheyenne. Walt Tanner had come back with Gideon and sat at the kitchen table while Elena organized the packet, and he'd read through the copies himself with the slow deliberateness of a man who wanted to be certain he understood exactly what he was looking at before he put his name to anything. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Elena and said, "My wife's cousin is a woman named Dorothea Hale. She's been in that office since before the current commissioner took his position. She knows where everything is and how everything works." "Will she take this seriously?" Elena said. "She takes everything seriously," Walt said. "It's her primary quality." He paused. "I wrote in my letter that she should contact you directly if she needs anything further. I said you'd know how to answer her questions." Elena nodded. "Thank you, Walt." He waved that off in the manner of someone who didn't want to be thanked for something he considered obvious. "Hargrove's going to know something's moving," he said. "He probably already does if Croft went to him after yesterday." "He will know," Elena said. "We have to assume that." "Then what do we do about the creek in the meantime?" Gideon said. He was standing near the window, and Elena could see in his posture the particular tension of a man who was managing two timelines at once: the legal process, which moved at its own pace regardless of what anyone wanted, and the cattle, which were subject to the physics of water and heat and couldn't wait on Cheyenne. "We dig," Elena said. Both men looked at her. "The lower pasture has groundwater," she said. "Not deep. I noticed it the first week, so there's a low corner of that field where the grass is a different shade in the mornings, darker, which means moisture's closer to the surface. If we dig a supplemental well there, even a shallow one, it won't replace the creek, but it will keep the herd stable while we wait for the commissioner's office to act." Gideon looked at Walt. Walt looked at the window, thinking. "I've got the equipment," he said, "and I can spare 2 days." "I don't want you to spend 2 days on our—" Gideon started. "Gideon," Walt said, in the tone of a man who has been a neighbor long enough to be tired of the word "oh." "I've got the equipment and I can spare 2 days. Stop talking." Gideon stopped talking. They started on the supplemental well the next morning. Walt came with his son and his drilling equipment, and the work was loud and physical and went through the whole first day without producing much. And Lila watched from a safe distance with a focused expression and periodically brought water to the men working, not because anyone asked her, but because she'd decided it was a useful thing to do, and she was correct. Elena split her attention between the well work and the house and the creek, measuring the north branch every morning and writing the number in the ledger with the date and time and a brief notation of the weather conditions. She kept the ledger on the kitchen shelf, and Lila had taken to reading the entries back to her each morning, reading them aloud in her careful voice with the seriousness of someone reciting evidence. 7th of July, Lila said one morning. 6.5 inches, clear, wind from the north. "That's right," Elena said. "It was 8 inches on the 1st of July, Lila said. "It was." "That's a lot less." "Yes," Elena said. "It is." Lila set the ledger down. "Is Croft still doing it?" "We think so." "Can he be stopped from doing it?" "Yes," Elena said, "but it takes time." Lila looked at the ledger. "The well will help," she said. "It will," Elena said. "Your father and Walt are working on it." Lila nodded with the air of someone who has reviewed the available information and arrived at a provisional conclusion. "Okay," she said, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before, which was arranging a collection of small stones on the windowsill in a pattern that made sense to her. Elena watched her for a moment. Then she turned back to the bread she was making, working the dough with both hands, and let her mind do what it did when her hands were occupied. Go over the sequence of things, check it for gaps, look for the place where something could go wrong that she hadn't accounted for. The gap she kept finding was Hargrove. The response from Cheyenne came faster than Elena had expected, which she understood to mean one of two things. Either Dorothea Hale had read the documents and immediately understood their significance, or someone in Hargrove's network had already reached the commissioner's office, and this was a response to that contact rather than to hers. The letter was brief and came directly to Elena's name, which itself told her something. Dear Mrs. Mercer, it read, I have reviewed the materials forwarded through Mr. Walter Tanner and find them to require immediate attention. I am requesting that you and your husband present yourselves at the Commissioner's office in Cheyenne on the 14th of this month. Please bring any original documents in your possession. I am writing separately to your attorney of record, Mr. Addison. This matter will be treated with discretion until we have had an opportunity to speak. Yours faithfully, D. Hale, Senior Records Officer, Office of the Territorial Land Commissioner. Elena read the letter twice and then set it down and stood very still for a moment. Treated with discretion. That phrase was doing specific work in that sentence. It meant Hale knew or suspected that someone within the system was implicated, and she was signaling that she wasn't going to make noise before she'd spoken to Elena directly. It was the kind of language a person used when they were being careful, when they were taking something seriously. She brought the letter to Gideon that evening and watched him read it. He read it the way he read anything important, slowly, going back over sections, not moving on until he'd absorbed the previous part. The 14th, he said. That's 4 days. We can make Cheyenne in 4 days, she said. We should go the day before and stay overnight so we're not arriving tired. He looked up from the letter. Both of us. Both of us, she said. She addressed it to both of us. She wants to see us together. He was quiet for a moment. Lila. Cora Tanner, Elena said. She's already said Lila can stay whenever we need. Lila is comfortable there. He nodded slowly, looking at the letter again. Addison's been contacted separately. He'll be there too. Good. He should be. She sat down across from him. Gideon, this is the meeting that matters. Everything we've gathered, the Walsh statement, the Meridian transfer records, the creek measurements, Fitch's copies, this is the moment when it either goes somewhere or it doesn't. Hale can bring this to the commissioner directly. The commissioner has authority over county land officers. He can remove Hargrove, Gideon said. He can suspend him pending investigation, Elena said. And once Hargrove is suspended, the procedural challenge against our filing falls apart. It only has weight because Hargrove gave it weight. Gideon put the letter down on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. What if Croft gets ahead of this? What if he's already talked to someone in the commissioner's office? It was the question she'd been sitting with since the letter arrived. Then Hale's letter reads differently, she said. The discretion language, the separate contact with Addison, coming directly to my name. A person who was compromised wouldn't be this careful. She'd either be warmer to manage us, or she'd give us less than this. She paused. I think she's clean. I think she saw the documents and she knew immediately what she was looking at. You think, he said. I think, she confirmed. I'm not certain. I'm not certain about anything until we're in that room. He absorbed this. He didn't push back on it, which was one of the things about him she'd come to rely on. He didn't argue with honest uncertainty. He just accepted it as the accurate description of the situation and moved forward from there. We leave the 13th, he said. Morning, she said. Early. He nodded. They were both quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the evening was cooling and the crickets had started, and from somewhere in the house, Lila could be heard conducting a one-sided conversation with what Elena had determined was a small cloth doll, explaining something to it in a patient voice. Elena, Gideon said. She looked at him. When this is over, he stopped, started differently. I've been thinking about the room, Margaret's room. He was looking at the table. It shouldn't be a storage room. The things in there should either be properly put away or... He stopped again. She waited. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, he said. You don't have to say it right now, she said quietly. I know, but I want to. He looked up. You've been in this house for nearly a month, and there's a whole room you can't use because I left it. He shook his head. That's not fair to you. It was never fair to you. Elena was quiet for a moment. Gideon, I didn't come here needing a room. I have the room I have, and it's sufficient. She paused. But when you're ready, when it makes sense to you, we can talk about it. There's no pressure. There's no deadline. He exhaled. You're very patient with me. You're not difficult, she said. You're just moving at the speed you're moving. That's not the same thing. He looked at her with the expression she'd first noticed after the confrontation with Croft in the yard. something that had been approaching a shape for weeks and was now very nearly visible. "I'm glad you came," he said. It was a plain sentence, no decoration on it. "I know I said thank you before, but that was for the work. This is different. I'm just glad you're here." Elena looked at him across the kitchen table in the evening light. This man who burned 3 drafts of a letter before he wrote one he could live with and had spent 4 years making a home out of an aftermath, and had stood in his own yard and said, "We already have," with the certainty of a man who'd finally decided what he was going to hold on to. "I know," she said. "I could tell." They left for Cheyenne on the 13th before sunrise. Lila had been taken to the Tanner place the night before, where Cora had put her in the spare room with the yellow curtains that Lila had apparently approved of specifically. The parting had been characteristically Lila. She'd told Elena and Gideon to be careful, told them to make the lawyer write things down, and then informed them she intended to help Cora with her bread in the morning, and they should not worry about her. They had not worried about her exactly. But Elena had thought about her most of the first hour on the road, in the particular way you thought about someone when you'd recently understood that you'd stopped thinking about them as a responsibility and started thinking about them as someone you simply wanted to know was all right. The road to Cheyenne was long, and the weather held, and they talked some and were quiet some, which Elena had come to understand was the natural rhythm of traveling with Gideon. He was not a man who needed to fill silence, and she'd found she was grateful for that. She'd spent time with people who filled every silence and found it exhausting in a way that was hard to explain. They talked about the ranch, about the east fence line that still needed 2 new posts, about the lower pasture and what the supplemental well, which had finally struck water on Walt's second day, would change about the grazing rotation, about whether the number of chickens they had was the right number or too many or not enough, a conversation that had no particular resolution but occupied them for several miles. Somewhere past the halfway mark, Gideon said, "Tell me about the surveyor you worked for in Kansas." She glanced at him. "Why?" "I want to know," he said simply. She considered. His name was Albert Pruitt. He was 60 years old and very precise, and he'd been doing county survey work since before I was born. He liked his work done correctly, and he had no patience for shortcuts. She paused. "He hired me because I could read a set of figures and transcribe them accurately without making errors, and because I didn't complain about being in the field in bad weather. I think he also hired me because his previous assistant had been his nephew, and the nephew had embezzled from the petty accounts, and Pruitt had developed a general distrust of people who came recommended." "How long did you work for him?" 2 years and 3 months, until his eyesight started to go and his son came to take care of him. He sold the survey equipment and retired." She looked at the road ahead. "It was the best work I ever had. Not because it was pleasant every day, it wasn't, but because I understood what I was doing and I could see when I'd done it right." "Is that why you read the land claim documents the first morning?" "Partly." She thought about how to say the rest of it. "When you mentioned the water rights issue in your letter, I understood what that kind of language usually meant. I've seen survey filings where the language was deliberately vague, where someone wrote it that way on purpose so there'd be room to argue later. I wanted to know if that's what your father's filing was." "And it wasn't." "It wasn't," she said. "Your father filed it correctly, and the witness signature was solid, if faded. The ambiguity Croft's lawyer found was in a secondary reference that Pruitt would have called a draft notation, language that described the claim in general terms for context, not in legal terms for authority. Croft's lawyer knows the difference. He's been paid to pretend he doesn't." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You figured all of that out the first morning." "The first morning I figured out the claim was solid," she said. "The rest took a few days." He looked at the road. "I've been thinking about what it would have looked like if you hadn't come," he said. "If I'd been here alone when Croft's man came back with the challenge filing. If I'd been just a man with a legal notice he didn't fully understand, and a creek that was running low, and a 6-week delay in the process." "Don't do that," she said. "I know, but I keep thinking about Walsh, about what Walsh said in his letter, that he didn't understand what was happening until it was already too late to stop it." He paused. "That was going to be me." "Maybe," Elena said, "but it wasn't." "Because you read the papers." "Because you sent the letter," she said. "I wouldn't have been here if you hadn't sent the letter. Whatever happened after that started there." He was quiet. "Gideon," she said, "you knew something was wrong. You sent Rourke away. You wrote to Addison. You kept the original documents. You were fighting. You just didn't have the right tools yet. She looked at him. I brought some tools, that's all. He didn't answer that, but she saw something shift in his face. Not agreement exactly, but acceptance. The kind that comes not from being convinced, but from deciding to put something down. Cheyenne in July was busy with the particular energy of a territorial capital in summer. Supply wagons and land agents, and people moving between offices with the sense of business being conducted at pace. They arrived early on the 14th and found a room at a decent hotel on the main street. Not the most expensive and not the cheapest, which was where Elena had said to stay when Gideon asked, because the commissioner's office was the kind of place where the quality of your hotel was noticed and either helped or didn't. Addison met them in the lobby at 8:30. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a good suit and the manner of someone who had handled enough land disputes to have developed a particular vigilance around ones that involved public officials. He shook Gideon's hand. He shook Elena's hand and looked at her with an expression that was professional, but held something like curiosity in it, the look of a man who'd received a letter from this woman and had read it 3 times. The documents you forwarded, he said to her, before any other greeting. The Fitch copies, the Walsh statement, the Meridian deed, I've read them all. And, Elena said, and if Dorothea Hale has read the same package, which I assume she has, then we are walking into a meeting today that will be significant. He paused. I want to be certain you understand that this could go in a direction we don't control once we put it in front of the commissioner's office. If they open a formal investigation, we're not the ones directing it. That's acceptable, Elena said. We don't need to direct it. We need Hargrove removed from authority over our filing and the procedural challenge dismissed. If an investigation produces more than that, that's the commissioner's matter. Addison looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. Exactly right. They went to the commissioner's office at 9 o'clock. Dorothea Hale was not what Elena had pictured, which she noted without letting it affect her. Hale was in her late 40s, small, with reading glasses pushed up on her head that she kept forgetting and then hunting for. And she had the kind of organized desk that spoke of someone who knew precisely where everything was and had strong opinions about anyone who moved anything. She greeted them at the door of a meeting room that held a table, 6 chairs, and 3 large windows through which the morning light came direct and clear. She did not do the thing that many people did when meeting Gideon and Elena together, which was look at Gideon as the principal party. She looked at them both with the same assessing quality, and when they sat down, she put the document packet on the table. Elena's packet, she could see from the envelope, and set her hands flat on top of it. I've read everything you sent, she said. Twice. I want to say that before we start. She looked at Elena. The summary letter you included, the one laying out the timeline of events, and the connection between the water disruptions and the Meridian transfers. Did you write that? Yes, Elena said. Where did you learn to write a document like that? I worked for a county surveyor for 2 years, Elena said. He wrote a lot of summary reports for legal proceedings. I helped him. Hale nodded, as if this answered several questions at once. Mr. Addison, she said, I've contacted your office by letter this morning. I want you to know that I spoke to the commissioner himself before this meeting. He has reviewed the key documents. He has authorized me to proceed. Addison's expression didn't change, but his stillness had a quality to it. Proceed with what specifically, Ms. Hale? With the suspension of Russell Hargrove pending a formal investigation into his conduct and financial interests as they relate to his official duties. She said it cleanly, without drama, the way she would have announced an appointment. That suspension will take effect today. Hargrove will be informed by end of business. The room was quiet. Gideon looked at Elena. She was looking at Hale. And the Croft challenge filing, Addison said. The procedural challenge will be reviewed by an independent reviewer appointed by this office. Given that the officer who received and acted on the challenge has a financial interest in one of the parties affected by the outcome, the challenge will almost certainly be dismissed. Hale paused. I say almost certainly because I won't represent certainty I don't have, but the conflict of interest alone is sufficient grounds. The water rights, Gideon said. His voice was controlled, but Elena could hear what was in it. 3 weeks of creek measurements and cattle pressure and a ledger with numbers that had been going in the wrong direction. Your original filing stands, Hale said, looking at him directly. The 1873 claim is in order. I've had our own surveyor review the legal description this morning, and the ambiguity Croft's lawyer identified is not an ambiguity in the claim itself. It's in a contextual reference. Your water rights on the North Branch are yours, Mr. Mercer. That is my reading and the commissioner's reading. Gideon put his hands flat on the table, which Elena recognized as the thing he did when he needed a moment. The Meridian transfers, Elena said. The other properties, Walsh and the others. That's the larger investigation, Hale said. It goes beyond your filing and beyond this office's immediate authority. We'll be referring the pattern of transfers to the Territorial Attorney General. She looked at Elena. The summary document you wrote will be part of that referral. With your permission. With our permission, Gideon said, before Elena could answer, and she heard in it the same thing she'd heard when he said my wife at the kitchen table, the accurate word, used without ceremony. Yes, Elena said, whatever is useful. Hale looked at them both. She had the quality of a person who had done this work for a long time and had learned to read rooms and people quickly, and there was something in the way she looked at them that wasn't professional courtesy, but something a little warmer than that, the look of someone who understood what it had taken to build what was sitting on her table. There may be further correspondence, she said. Questions from the Attorney General's office, requests for additional statements. I'll direct them to your attorney of record. She stood, which meant the meeting was over. She extended her hand to Gideon and then to Elena. Mrs. Mercer, she said, when she shook Elena's hand, you documented this very well. It needed to be documented, Elena said. Yes, Hale said. It did. More people should understand that. They walked out of the commissioner's office into the July morning and stood on the street for a moment, the three of them. And Addison said something about the filing next steps and the timeline, and Elena heard it and responded appropriately, but part of her was still in the room with Hale, still feeling the particular quality of the moment when Hale had said your water rights on the North Branch are yours. Addison shook their hands again and went to his office to begin the paperwork, and Elena and Gideon were left on the street with the business of Cheyenne moving around them. Gideon said nothing for a moment. He looked at the street. Then he said, It worked. Part of it, she said. The Hargrove piece and the challenge piece. The rest is the Attorney General's matter. But our piece worked. Yes, she said. Our piece worked. He exhaled. The same long, slow breath she'd heard from him after Rourke rode away. The same release of pressure, but larger now. He put his hand over his face for a moment, briefly, and she looked away to give him the second to himself. When she looked back, he was looking at her with the expression she'd been watching for him for 3 weeks, the one that had been approaching a shape, and now it had one. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't the thing people expected to see on a man's face when something good had just happened. It was more like recognition, the way a person looked when they finally understood something they'd been trying to understand for a while. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes? That letter you wrote, the summary, the timeline, you wrote it the night Fitch came. Yes. That was... He paused. How long did it take you? She thought about it. 2 hours? A little more? He nodded slowly. You've been doing that your whole life, he said, looking at the shape of things and figuring out how they connect. I suppose so, she said. Pruitt trained some of it, he said, but not all of it. No, she said. Not all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Where does the rest come from? She looked at the street. A wagon was going past slowly, loaded with barrels. A woman on the opposite side was talking to a shopkeeper. The ordinary busy morning of a capital city, indifferent to what had just happened inside the building behind them. From paying attention, she said. When I was young, I learned that if you didn't pay attention, things happened to you instead of being things you could see coming. So I paid attention. She paused. It's not a gift. It's just a habit I built because I needed it. Gideon looked at her for a moment with the recognition still in his face. What happened when you were young? He said. That taught you that. She considered whether to answer and how. It was not something she talked about. It was kept at a distance for reasons that were practical and also not entirely practical, and she knew it. But she also knew this. This man had gone into a room where his dead wife's belongings were, looking for a letter that might help their legal case, and had come out with dust on his sleeve and a piece of paper in his hand, and an expression she hadn't looked at directly, because some things were not her business yet. Yet. My father lost our farm when I was 12, she said. Not to a drought or a bad season. To a man who found a flaw in a document and used it, and my father didn't understand the document well enough to fight it. She kept her voice level. We moved 5 times in 3 years after that. My mother worked wherever she could find work. I watched my father become a man who'd stopped believing he could understand things well enough to protect them. She paused. I decided very early that I was not going to be someone who didn't understand the documents. Gideon said nothing. He just listened, which was what she'd needed, and she'd known from the quality of his silence that it was what he'd give her. That's why I read your filing the first morning, she said. Not just because of Pruitt, because I have spent my whole life learning to read the documents. He looked at her. I'm sorry, he said. About your father. About the farm. It was a long time ago, she said. It doesn't look like a long time ago, he said quietly, when you talk about it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, No, it doesn't feel like one sometimes. He nodded. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't push any further, and she was grateful for that too. The way she'd learned to be grateful for all the things he didn't do that a different man might have. We should get some food, she said, and then start back before the afternoon gets hot. Yes, he said. But he didn't move immediately. He stood there a moment longer, on the street in Cheyenne, with the meeting just behind them and the road home ahead of them. Elena, he said. She waited. When we get back, he said, I want to go through Margaret's room properly, not looking for something, just go through it, decide what to keep, what to put away. He looked at his hands briefly. I think it's time. She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, and she accepted both. Okay, she said, when we get back. I'd like you to be there, he said. If you're willing, not to. I just don't want to do it alone. I'll be there, she said. They walked to find food, and the morning was very bright, and neither of them said much for a while, which was fine, because the silence between them had long since become the kind that didn't need filling. They arrived back at the ranch on the evening of the 15th, later than they'd planned because one of the horses had thrown a shoe 6 miles out, and they'd had to walk the last stretch at a pace the horses could manage, which meant arriving in the blue dark just before full night with dusty coats and tired legs, and the particular satisfaction of people who have been a long way from home and are now back in sight of it. Lila was at the Tanner place. Elena had said they'd collect her in the morning. Cora had sent word back, she's fine. She showed my husband how to sort survey measurements. He is baffled and delighted. Elena had read that note on the road and felt something move in her chest that she didn't examine closely, but didn't dismiss either. The house was dark and quiet when they came in. Gideon lit the lamp in the kitchen, and Elena put the kettle on, and they sat at the table with the dust of the road still on them. And it was a different kind of quiet than the silence on the street in Cheyenne. It was the quiet of their own place, their own table, their own particular evening sounds. Hargrove will know by now, Gideon said. Yes, Elena said, and Croft will know. What does Croft do? He considers his options, she said. His challenge is going to be dismissed. Hargrove is suspended. The Attorney General has the Meridian records. Croft still has his cattle company and his lawyers, but the scheme that was working, that's done. She paused. He may try something else. He may not. A man like that calculates risk. He miscalculated this one, Gideon said. He didn't account for Fitch, Elena said, and he didn't account for you having someone who could read the documents. The kettle heated. She made tea. She set a cup in front of him and sat with her own, and it was the same table and the same cups as the first night. But the room felt completely different, or she felt completely different in it, one of the two, maybe both. Gideon looked at his cup. The room, he said. I said we'd go through it when we got back. We just got back, she said. It can be tomorrow. I know, I just wanted to say that I meant it. I didn't say it in the moment, and then he looked up. I mean it. I know you do, she said. He nodded. He picked up his cup and looked at the table and then said, without quite looking at her, I wrote the letter to the agency because Lila needed someone. I said that before, but I want to say something else. He stopped. I know what this is supposed to be. A practical arrangement. A contract. I know that's what I offered, and what you agreed to. He turned his cup slowly. But I don't think of it that way anymore. I haven't for a while. Elena looked at him. I don't know exactly when it changed, he said. Maybe it was the fence post. Maybe it was the creek measurements. Maybe it was… He stopped. It might have been the night I came back from Cheyenne, and you'd written a letter to me there and had already talked to Walt and measured the creek twice and moved the cattle to the lower pasture and made a plan. He finally looked at her. I don't know, but I want you to know that I'm not thinking about a contract. Elena set her cup down. She had known this was coming, in the way she knew things that had been building for a while. She had watched it form across the weeks the same way she'd watched the shape of the legal problem become visible as more pieces arrived. She'd let it form without pushing on it, without managing it, the way you let something take its actual shape rather than the shape you're expecting. Gideon, she said, when I agreed to come here, I told myself it was a practical decision, work to be done, a place that needed someone. She paused. That was true. It was also not everything that was true. He looked at her. I read your letters, she said, all 5 of them. There was something in the way you wrote, not what you said, but the way you said it, like someone who had given a lot of thought to honesty and decided to practice it even when it was uncomfortable. She looked at the table briefly, then back at him. I've met men who wrote to the agency who were looking for something easy. You weren't. You were looking for something real. She paused. I wanted something real too. I had wanted it for a long time. The kitchen was very still. I'm not saying it in a particular kind of way, she said carefully. I'm just saying that what I feel about being here is not the feeling of someone fulfilling a contract. It hasn't been for a while. He held her gaze. His face had the expression she'd been watching form since Cheyenne, and now she could name it. It was the expression of a man who had been a long time in one kind of life, and was just beginning to believe that a different kind was actually available to him, not yet certain, not yet easy, but beginning. All right, he said quietly. All right, she said. The night settled around the house. The lamp threw its small circle of light across the table. Somewhere outside, a coyote called once and went quiet. Upstairs, or at the Tanner place, rather, in the room with the yellow curtains, Lila was asleep, having sorted someone's survey measurements and educated someone's husband, wholly herself, wholly unbothered, as she generally was. Elena finished her tea. Gideon finished his. Neither of them moved to go to bed immediately, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was the easiest silence Elena Rowan could remember being in for a very long time. The morning after they returned from Cheyenne, Gideon went through Margaret's room. He did it the way he did difficult things, without announcement, without building up to it. Elena was in the kitchen when she heard the door open down the hall, and she stayed where she was and let him start without her, because she understood that the first few minutes of something like that belonged to a person alone. She gave him 10 minutes. Then she went. He was standing in the middle of the room with a small wooden box open in his hands, looking at something inside it. The room was plain: a bed with a faded quilt, a dresser, a trunk against the wall, a single shelf with a few objects on it arranged with the care of someone who'd meant to add to them and hadn't gotten the chance. It smelled like cedar and old fabric and the particular stillness of a place that hadn't been aired in years. He didn't look up when she came in. She kept everything organized, he said, even things I wouldn't have thought to keep. Elena came and stood beside him and looked into the box. Letters, a few small photographs, a child's drawing, Lila's from the look of it, though she'd have been very small when she made it. A pressed flower, brown at the edges. She sounds like someone Lila takes after, Elena said. Yes. He set the box on the dresser. That's what people always said, that Lila had her way. He paused. I used to find that hard to hear, not anymore. Elena looked at the shelf. On it sat a small clock that had stopped, a smooth river stone, and a thimble. Things that had meant something to someone, small enough to hold in a palm. What do you want to keep? She said. All of it, he said. Just not in here. Not like this. He looked around the room slowly. Lila should have some of these things, when she's old enough to understand what they are. He looked at the small drawing in the box. She drew that before she was 2. Margaret kept it. Of course she did, Elena said. They worked through the room together over the next 2 hours. and it was not the orderly, resolved experience that stories sometimes made of such things. Gideon stopped twice and said nothing for a full minute, and Elena did not fill those minutes with words. She picked up objects and he told her what they were, or he didn't, and she set them in one of three places: to keep and store properly, to give to Lila in time, to let go of. He made those decisions himself, and she didn't guide them, only asked when he seemed uncertain. At one point he found a folded piece of paper in the trunk that he opened and read, and then refolded without speaking, and put it in his coat pocket, and she understood without asking that this was the one thing in the room that was only his. When they were done, the room was empty of personal objects. It was just a room with good light and a bed and a dresser, and it smelled less like a sealed place and more like somewhere a window could fix. Gideon stood in the doorway and looked at it. "It can be whatever it needs to be," he said. "It doesn't need to be anything today," Elena said. He nodded. He pulled the door to, not shut, just to, and they went back to the kitchen, and she made coffee, and he sat at the table, and they were both quiet in the way of people who have done something that mattered and don't need to explain it to each other. Lila came home that afternoon, brought by Walt's son in the Tanner wagon, and she walked through the door with her small bag and the calm proprietary air of someone returning from a trip rather than an overnight stay. "Cora taught me her biscuit recipe," she announced. "It's different from yours." "Different how?" Elena said. "More butter," Lila said. "She said not to tell you, but I don't think that's fair." Elena looked at her. "I appreciate the honesty." Lila set her bag down and looked at both of them in turn with the assessing quality she'd inherited from wherever she'd inherited it. "Something happened," she said. "Good something or bad something?" "Good," Gideon said. "The legal matter in Cheyenne went well. The water rights are secure." Lila processed this. "So we stay," she said. "We stay," he said. She nodded once, definitive, as if she'd been waiting to receive this information so she could file it correctly. "Okay," she said, and picked up her bag and took it to her room. The matter settled to her satisfaction. Gideon looked at Elena. Elena looked at the door Lila had disappeared through. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to control or contain. It was too quick and too genuine for that. She turned back to the stove and went on with what she was doing, and Gideon said nothing, because he'd seen it, and saying nothing was the right answer. The formal letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office arrived 3 weeks later. Elena read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, while Gideon was in the yard and Lila was doing her lessons on the bench by the window. It was long and written in the particular dense language of official proceedings, and she translated it as she went, stripping the language to its skeleton. Russell Hargrove had been formally removed from his position as county land officer, pending a criminal investigation into his conduct. The investigation had been expanded to cover the full scope of Meridian land and waters acquisitions in Converse County and 2 adjoining counties, which had revealed a pattern going back further than even Fitch's documents had indicated. Closer to 5 years, not 3, with 22 properties involved in total. The Croft Cattle Company's legal challenges in all pending cases had been dismissed. A separate referral had been made to examine the conduct of 2 attorneys, one of them the man named Dreyer. The letter addressed the Mercer water rights specifically in its final paragraph. The original 1873 claim was confirmed valid and entered into the official record without qualification. No further challenge was anticipated. She set the letter down. 22 properties, 22 families who had walked through different versions of what she and Gideon had almost walked through. Some of them, like Walsh, had already lost what they'd lost and were not going to get it back. The letter said nothing about restitution, and she didn't expect it would. The law could stop a thing that was continuing. It was slower and less certain about what had already been done. She thought about her father, about the farm in Ohio and the document he hadn't understood, and the man who had found the flaw in it, and the 5 moves in 3 years that had followed, and the way her father had become someone different after, quieter, more careful, less willing to believe that he could hold on to things. She had spent a long time being angry about that. At the man who'd taken the farm, at the document, at a system that seemed designed to reward people who understood how it worked at the expense of people who didn't. That anger had been useful. It had driven her to Pruitt's office. It had made her read every filing twice. It had made her the person who read the 1873 claim the first morning before anything else. But it had also been a thing she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. She sat with the letter for a moment and thought about what it meant that she was here, in this kitchen, in this house, in this particular life that had not been the plan and was more than she had let herself expect. She thought about Lila's voice reading creek measurements back to her, patient and precise. She thought about Gideon standing in his front yard saying, "We already have like a man who had finally found the thing he was going to hold on to." She thought, "My father lost his farm because he didn't understand the documents, and there was no one beside him who did." She thought, "That is not what happened here. It wasn't resolution exactly of the old thing. You didn't resolve things like that. They just slowly became part of the distance behind you rather than the weight you were carrying forward. But it was something. It was the particular quiet of a person who has put something down in the right place." She folded the letter and set it on the shelf where she kept the correspondence and went outside to find Gideon. I was at the north fence line, which had become something of a regular project in the weeks since they'd returned from Cheyenne. He decided to rebuild the north section properly. New posts, new wire, done right. And he went at it in the mornings with the steady focus he brought to things he'd decided on. Elena had found herself going to watch sometimes, not to help particularly, but just to be nearby, which she recognized as a habit she'd developed without intending to. She came up behind him, and he heard her and turned. She held up the letter. He came and took it, and read it standing there with the tools in his other hand, dust on his gloves, and she watched his face go through the letter, the same way it went through everything important, slowly, fully. When he finished, he handed it back. "Hargrove," he said. "Removed and under investigation," she said. "Dreer." Also referred. He looked at the letter once more and then at her. 22 families, he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Walsh." "Walsh won't get his land back," she said. "I don't think the letter suggests that's possible, but what happened to him is now part of an official record. It's documented. What Croft and Dreyer and Hargrove did to him is it's not invisible anymore." Gideon looked at the fence line. "Is that enough?" "No," she said honestly. "It's not enough. But it's not nothing." He nodded slowly. "We should write to Walsh." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "He made this possible. His letter was part of what Hale took to the commissioner. He should hear what came of it." "You'll write it?" "We'll both sign it," she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know, the one that wasn't gratitude and wasn't love exactly yet, but was moving toward both with the deliberateness of a man who did things carefully when they mattered. "All right," he said. He turned back to the fence. She stayed a few minutes, watching him work, and then went back to the house. The creek recovered by August. It didn't happen all at once. It came back the way it had left, gradually, measurable in the increments Elena recorded each morning. The numbers in the ledger reversed their direction: 6.5, 7, 7 3/4, 8, 8.5. The herd moved back to the north pasture. The supplemental well in the lower field stayed open, because Walt had said to leave it as insurance, and Elena had agreed, and Gideon had said if the two of them agreed on something, he wasn't going to argue the point. The morning the creek reached its usual level for early August, Elena made the notation in the ledger and set the pen down and sat for a moment looking at the page of numbers that told the story of a summer that had nearly gone a different way. She thought about the first measurement she'd made, standing at the bank in the early light while Lila was inside with her book. The cold, precise attention she'd felt. The way she'd walked back to the house and written the letter to Gideon in Cheyenne and the letter to Walt on the same day without knowing yet whether either one would do anything. She closed the ledger. Lila came in from outside with her boots muddy and her expression purposeful. "The black cat had kittens," she announced. Elena looked up. "The barn cat?" "3 of them. They're in the corner behind the feed sacks. I found them." "Did you touch them?" Lila gave her a look. "I know not to touch them." "Good." "I just looked." She stood in the kitchen doorway, still purposeful. "Can we keep them?" "They live in the barn already." "I mean as mine, as my cats." Elena considered this. "We'll ask your father. He'll say yes if you say yes first," Lila said, with complete confidence in the mechanics of this transaction. Elena looked at her. "Did you just tell me I'm easier to persuade than your father?" Lila's expression said this was obviously true, and she wasn't sure why it needed to be said. "You think about things practically," she said. 3 barn cats are practical." Elena pressed her lips together against a smile she didn't quite suppress. Go wash your boots. Lila went. Elena looked at the closed ledger and the window and the ordinary bright morning outside it, and felt, not happiness exactly, because happiness was a word that covered too much and too little at once. What she felt was something closer to the sensation of standing on ground that held, of having tested the weight and found it solid. She'd spent most of her adult life being careful not to put too much weight on things, on places, on arrangements, on people. She had learned, from the farm and from the years after it, to keep enough of herself in reserve so that what she'd lose if something collapsed was manageable. It was a sensible strategy. It had kept her functional through difficult years. It was also a way of living that made you very capable and very alone. She looked at the ledger and thought about the first morning in this house, when she'd gone through the papers before Gideon was up, and Lila had appeared in the doorway in bare feet and said, I thought maybe I dreamed it, and Elena had pulled out the chair beside her without thinking about whether it was the right amount of warmth for a person she'd known for 8 hours. She hadn't been careful that morning. She'd just done the natural thing. She thought maybe that had been the start of it. Not the legal work, not the creek measurements, not the letter to Cheyenne. Maybe it had been that. The chair pulled out, the papers explained, a small person leaning in to look at something she was genuinely curious about. The weight she'd put on this place since that morning was not manageable if it collapsed. She understood that now. She'd put down the reserve strategy somewhere along the way without fully deciding to, and she was not going to get it back, and she was, after considering it honestly in the quiet of the kitchen, not sorry about that. It was the least careful thing she'd done in 20 years. It was also, she thought, probably right. Gideon came in for midday, and she told him about the kittens. And he said, as Lila had predicted, that if Elena thought it was a good idea, it was fine with him. Elena said 3 barn cats were practical, and he said he knew that, which suggested he'd also already decided and was simply confirming the consensus. Lila, who had been listening from the other room, came in and announced the cats' names, which she had already chosen. She named them Survey, Ledger, and North Branch. Gideon looked at his daughter. Those are unusual names for cats. They're good names, Lila said. They're names that mean something. He looked at Elena. Elena looked back at him with an expression that said, I take no responsibility for this, and also I think she's correct. He turned back to his food. Survey, Ledger, and North Branch, he said. Yes, Lila said. All right, he said. Lila sat down satisfied in the manner of someone who has conducted a successful negotiation, though she had simply named things she'd already decided on and stated them as facts, which was arguably more effective than negotiation. They ate. The afternoon came. Work continued the way it always did on a working ranch, which was to say it did not stop for sentiment or resolution or the completion of significant chapters. It simply continued, and the people in it continued alongside it, changed and unchanged at once. In the last days of August, a letter came from Clement Walsh. He had written in response to theirs. The letter Elena and Gideon had written together the week after the Attorney General's notice arrived. Walsh's letter was not long. It was a man writing who was not practiced at letters and didn't have easy language for what he wanted to say. He thanked them for writing. He said he had heard from the Attorney General's office directly about the investigation. He said he understood he would not get his land back and he was trying to make his peace with that, though he acknowledged in plain language that he wasn't fully there yet and might not be for a while. Then, in the last paragraph, he wrote something that Elena read twice. My wife says I am not the same man I was before all of this. I think she means I am worse in some ways and maybe better in others. I am more careful about documents than I used to be. I am also less certain that being careful is always enough. What helped you was partly documents and partly something else, and I am still figuring out what to call the something else. Elena thought about that for a long time. She thought Walsh was right that there had been something else, and she thought she understood what it was, even if it was hard to name. It was not luck exactly. It was not just skill. It was the particular result of 2 people deciding, without fully articulating it, to face the same direction, to treat what was threatening one of them as something threatening both of them, to not divide the work into mine and yours, but simply to see what needed doing and do it. She had come to Wyoming to be useful. She had expected to be capable and present and dependable, which was what she'd always been, and which she'd thought was enough. had told herself was enough for years. She had not expected to find that the thing she'd been careful not to put too much weight on was already holding her. That was the something else. That was what Walsh couldn't name yet. You couldn't name it while you were in it. You could only look back at a particular morning, a letter written, a chair pulled out, a fence post checked, and understand that at some point the arithmetic had changed, and you'd stopped being a woman honoring a contract and become someone who was simply home. She folded Walsh's letter carefully and put it in the box on the shelf with the others. Hale's letter, the Attorney General's notice, the letter Gideon had brought back from Addison, Fitch's careful copies. The record of a summer, the documents of a thing that had been threatened and had held. She went to find Lila, who was in the barn introducing Survey to the concept of being held, with mixed results. "She doesn't like it," Lila reported. "Give her time," Elena said. "How much time?" "However much she needs," Elena said. "You can't rush a cat into trusting you. You just have to keep showing up and let her decide." Lila looked at the small, indignant cat. "That seems inefficient." "Most things worth having are," Elena said. Lila considered this with the seriousness she brought to things she suspected were being said on more than one level. She looked at Elena, then back at Survey. "Okay," she said, and set the cat down gently and sat on the barn floor to wait. Elena leaned against the doorframe and watched the late afternoon come across the yard, the long gold light of August that made everything look the way things looked when you were paying attention to them, which was different from how they looked when you weren't. The barn smell, the sound of the horses, Lila's patient silence on the barn floor, and the small cat regarding her from a careful distance. Gideon came around the corner from the north fence and saw her in the doorway and walked over with the end-of-day quality about him, tired and settled, and came to stand beside her. "How's the fence?" she said. "Done," he said. "The whole north section." "Really done, or done until next season?" "Really done," he said. "I want it to hold." She looked at the yard and the fence line in the distance and the sky going long and pale above the hills. "It will," she said. He stood beside her in the doorway, not touching, but close in the way that had become natural over the weeks, the way of two people who have learned each other's particular gravity and settled into it without fuss. From inside the barn, Lila said, in a very quiet voice, "She's coming closer." Neither of them spoke, so as not to break whatever was happening. They stood in the doorframe and waited, and after a moment Lila said, softer still, "She's right here." Elena looked at Gideon. He looked at her. There was a whole conversation in it, not romantic, not resolved into anything neat, just the look of two people who had been through something together and were standing on the other side of it, and could see, in the ordinary moment of a cat and a child in a barn doorway, all the specific things that had led here. None of it had been smooth. The fence post was done, but there were others. The creek was back, but the well stayed open. Walsh wouldn't get his land back. Hargrove was gone, but there would be other Hargroves, other Crofts, other documents that needed reading before someone with power decided to misread them. The world was not fixed. It was only changed in the ways they'd changed it, which were specific and local and enough for now. That was the thing nobody told you about fighting to hold on to something. It didn't end in the moment of victory. It ended in the ordinary day after, when you were still there and still working and still putting your weight on the ground you'd stayed to keep. This was that day. And the one after would be the same. Lila came out of the barn carrying Survey with the careful competence of a child who has figured out the right way to hold a reluctant cat, and her face had the particular radiance of someone who has been patient and been rewarded for it. "She let me," Lila said. "I saw," Elena said. Lila looked at her over the cat's small head, and then she said, in the plain, unhurried way she said things that were important, "Mama, look." The word arrived without warning. Elena felt it land, felt it the way you felt something you had not known you were waiting for, something that had no weight until the moment it settled and then had all the weight in the world. She didn't correct it. She didn't make anything of it. She just looked at the cat. "I see," she said. "She trusts you." Lila nodded, satisfied, and carried Survey back into the barn to introduce her to Ledger and North Branch. Elena stood in the doorway with her hand against the frame. Behind her she could feel Gideon's stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had just heard the same word and understood what it meant and was giving her the moment without putting anything on top of it. She stood there for a while. The evening came in from the east, long and slow. The creek ran north along the property line at its proper level, 8.5 inches of water moving through the land her husband's father had claimed in 1873 and her husband had held, and she had helped him hold. And it moved the same way it had always moved, the way water moved when nobody had interfered with it, quietly, constantly, certain of its direction. She had come to Wyoming on a train with a single bag and 5 letters of correspondence and an address to look for on a station platform. She had read the documents. She had measured the creek. She had written the letters that needed writing and asked the questions that needed asking and stood in the yard when standing in the yard was what was needed. She had not come looking for this. She had come looking for work and found a life, which was not the same thing and was also, in the end, the better thing. Not perfect. Not without loss or complication, or the particular weight of 2 people still learning each other across the distance of everything they'd each been through. Not a story that ended in the sense of being finished, just a story that had found its ground. She took her hand off the doorframe. She went inside to start supper, and the house was warm and full, and it was hers.